This video contains spoilers for Far Cry 6, so if you haven't yet beat the game, leave, but make sure you come back later. I beat Far Cry 6 last night, and I've got to admit, I'm very conflicted. On one hand, it's a nonsense story about Yaran freedom, and these freedom fighters known as guerillas, who systematically overthrow an evil regime. On the other hand, it's a tale that violence begets violence. And really, at the end of it, we're right back where we started. Except the city and its infrastructure now lies in ruins and a pile of dead soldiers. My final review is broken down into a few key areas. I will post timestamps in the description box below. The first, I will talk about the story and the theming. I will then talk about the character progression, particularly with upgrades, weapons, and vehicles. And lastly, I will give my final thoughts. So, the story and the theming was interesting because Far Cry is a batshit crazy game. And I don't think it ever pulled any punches or led us to believe it wasn't. The stories are always nonsensical. The NPCs you meet are crazy. The missions you partake are crazy. And this is no exception to Far Cry 6. But the game does touch on some key areas that really do make you think. You're talking about these serious missions that take place in the game. The ones that have serious repercussions where we see human trafficking and major violence being depicted, aggression, what the real impacts are of overthrowing an establishment. Not just in terms of, you killed soldiers, which means you can drive on the road more freely, but in terms of destroying architecture and logistical supply lines and what it actually does to the people you're quote-unquote freeing. And I think those resonate really, really well. As I said, though, most areas do end with piles of ashes and debris, and it's a sense of quote-unquote victory. But I think the question that it keeps asking us is this victory? Look, revolutions are violent, okay? And without clear leadership, this whole cycle of violence is destined to repeat itself, which is exactly what happens in this game. You look at the resolution at the end. You have a bunch of quote-unquote leaders who are now in charge thanks to Danny's, heroic, if you want to even use that word, exploits in taking down this regime. But these leaders that are in charge, they have no idea what the hell they are doing. There's a really, really telling final scene, and it's with Juan, who's one of the early guerillas you meet, who is kind of one of your many mentors. He says, Danny, don't fool yourself. There will be no election. In other words, you've done all this to give freedom back to the people, but you're not going to actually give it back to the people. Not because the people are power hungry, but because we don't know how to do that, because there's no established rule for that. And ultimately, we're going to just rule the same way the other guy ruled before, maybe a little softer, but ultimately, at the end of the day, we're going to be the same as him. And I think that's really telling, kind of, and I think that resonated with me more than really anything else, any other line in the game or any other moment in the game, I think. And it was such a throwaway line, too. That's what was so frustrating, but it really resonated with me personally. So there are these three areas that you do have to explore. Madrugada, El Este, and Valle de Oro. I apologize to those Spanish speakers for absolutely butchering your language. When you do rescue, each of these three zones have leaders who are pivotal to the revolution, whether they're social media presence or they're freedom fighters of the past, or they just have a lot of money and power in an area. It's determined through the game's mechanics, obviously, that these are the three groups of people that you need to cater to. So the structure largely follows other Far Cry games. You go to a said area, you have to do missions to kind of impress these people, to kind of work with them, and then ultimately they will join you. Along the way, you're going to have to take out the big bad of the area, and the game is designed that the big bads are structurally located in each of these three zones, whether it's major supply lines or a military force or the marketing campaign associated with the big bad. You're going to basically be taking out these ruthless leaders while you support these local factions. However, when you kind of start to get to know these guerillas that are in these areas, it is very clear that they're either old, inept, or inexperienced. And their vision of a free Yara, which is basically the country that you're supporting, Yara, right? Their visions don't necessarily align, and they don't really make sense. They keep saying we want to be free. Free of what exactly? And the game doesn't push this narrative nearly as much as I hoped it would, but I do find it incredibly interesting that as I am going through this game and as I am, freeing these people and, basically killing everybody who opposes them, all I've done is make things worse. There's a lot more chaos and anarchy in the streets, major infrastructure damage, for what? So what does this all lead to? Well, it leads to the pivotal scene at the end of the game where you finally, corner Anton Castillo and his son, Diego. And it's revealed that Castillo, who's now dying of this revolutionary drug that was supposed to save him, which I'll get to in a little bit, ultimately doesn't know what is going to happen. What's the fate of his country? He's nervous. He's scared. But he realizes in the conversation with you that his vision isn't going to be met. He wants to build this grand city. He wants to be the center of the world. He's going to use this wonder drug to finance all of his dreams and desires. And, he's realizing that as the freedom fighters are closing down on him and his city is literally burning outside his doors, that it's no place for him. Obviously, he's dying. But he's nervous about his son, and he does ask 3 or 4 times in that final cutscene, "Do you promise you'll take care of my son?" And your character keeps saying, "Yes, I will. He'll be safe with me. We're leaving. We're leaving this country," which I think is pretty telling in of itself. That hey, you did all of these things, you fought all of these people to do what? To leave the country? Because I think you may even realize you've started a fire you can't suppress. Which, again, very fascinating writing from such a dopey game. But Castillo says, death is certain and I'd rather take my chances. And a pretty crazy moment, he kills his son and then kills himself. And the game ends with them laying in a pool of their own blood with you and the other guerillas from these previous areas I mentioned. Now owning the city and well, now what? And nobody knows because we didn't think that far. We just wanted to riot and fight and kill and murder, and we did, but now what? So what was the point of all of this? Like I said at the beginning of this video, violence begets violence? What are we supposed to take away from this? And I think it's a very interesting question, and I think that's why I'm conflicted about Far Cry, because there are a lot of stupid elements, but I think it really does hammer a pretty solid point home when we think of all the political unrest in the world and how we demand change and what are we actually demanding. So in that sense, I think the story was incredibly well written, and it does leave a very long-lasting impression. I think it will, at least. So what of Viviro? So I didn't really talk about that, but Viviro is this wonder drug, and this is the drug that kind of fuels Castillo's empire. Basically, it is a cancer-curing magical drug by spraying this magical chemical on this tobacco and smoking it, and it's going to cure cancer. And instead of kind of sharing the wealth, so to speak, and just mass-producing this, the Castillo Empire, this dictatorship that he has, creates an artificial sense of supply and demand to raise up the prices, of course, why wouldn't he, to make the most money he can. And he's going to get rich off this, but he's taking this money, and as you can see in the gameplay, he's not giving it back to the people. He's not increasing the roads. A lot of the roads are still dirt. A lot of people are still living by like gaslight and fires. There's not like a common electricity system grid. There's no major towns. He's clearly just kind of keeping it all to himself. So that's interesting that he's using it in such a negative way. But what we really find out, and I think the deeper message here that, again, the game glosses over, I don't know why, is we kind of find out that Viviro is a sham. The only real case study, quote unquote, that we have is when we find out that President Castillo is dying. And it turns out that while he's been taking this Viviro for many, many years, it stops working. Now, that doesn't mean to say he didn't get a longer life from it, but it's not a cancer cure. It's more of a, I don't want to even say deterrent, but it kind of slows the spread of the cancer. Well, nobody knows that. So everybody's buying this drug thinking that it's going to stop everything, and it's really not. As we know from Castillo, people are still going to die. So in a few years after this miracle effect wears off, that huge influx of money will probably start to drop off slightly. I think people are going to realize that this isn't what they thought it was. And all that money that they had accrued over the years is going to be spent where? Well, under Castillo's vision, it was building this massive city with his name and picture all over it, handing the reins to his son, who will rule with an iron fist just as he has, and all the money will go to them, and they'll live the best life they can, basically on the backs of the poor. But what's it really going to be spent doing? Well, considering there's not much money left, I guess it's going to be spent rebuilding the city that you essentially burned to the ground. The guerillas destroyed most of the plants and the factories and all the stockpiles of the stuff. You destroyed large portions of the naval fleet. So the country is going to most likely remain in this third world status. All of this, again, is back in a big circle. We got all this money, and all we're going to do is get back to where we started, which, again, kind of depressing. It seems Juan has figured out, obviously, how to sell some. At the post-credit scene, he's selling it to a smuggler. Kind of sounds like it's Voss from Far Cry 3. Remains to be seen. But it's clearly to a smuggler, which means it's not through official channels, which means it's not on the quote up and up. It's not going to really help out the country or the people. It's just going to go directly to Juan and whatever fanatical cause he decides to support, most likely more guerrilla fighting. In other words, it's just his personal gain. And again, that's all we're doing. He puts Juan, putting himself above others, is exactly what Anton did, which again indicates nothing has changed. All this we went through, and we're right back where we started. New faces, but same ideas. So I think that's kind of a good way of wrapping up my story review. It's just to say that, I think it really makes you think. I think it really makes you ponder kind of the meaning of what's going on in this game, and that, this violence and this force and this necessity to change, if not funneled correctly, ultimately will end in a lot of disaster, a lot of death, but for very, very, very little gain. And for that reason, I applaud the story. I thought it was very well written in that sense, and I thought it really made me think. Shifting over to character progression, specifically with upgrades, vehicles, and weapons, I thought the game was incredibly weak in this department. There were a slew of upgrades that were ultimately trumped by a few key upgrades, and I'll give the perfect example, and that's the armor-piercing rounds. Early on in the game, you find out that you can make different types of ammunition. There is incendiary ammunition, there is poison ammunition, amongst others. But it's very quickly realized by the player that armor-piercing rounds are the only rounds that you should be using, because every other round is just incredibly weak. When you combine that with the gear, and you find lots of gear in the game that basically give you different abilities. Run faster, swim faster, reload faster. Some of them even have things like damage buffs, like you'll do more fire damage, or enemies that are killed with poison will give you money, whatever. It doesn't matter, because you find out that the armor-piercing rounds are so much better than anything else you come across, even if those other pieces of gear are in fact buffed, that it kind of breaks the system. So you're going to basically find a build that works for you early on in the game, and you're never going to be incentivized to experiment or to change it. The gun that I used, I think 4 hours into the game, the kitted gun that I had, was the same gun that I finished the game with, because I never found anything better. Despite I went through all of these chests and treasure hunts and weapon caches and upgrades, it turns out that what I picked early on was the best. Silencers burn out very quickly, but if you want to upgrade the silencer so that it lasts longer, you're going to take a great damage nerf. It's also going to greatly reduce the effective range of the weapons. And I think you'll find that across all of the other types of weapons and upgrades, that while you may get some sort of perk, like I said with the silencer, ultimately you take so much other penalties, it's just not worth it. And I think that's frustrating. So I think a lot of the exploration and the padding that Ubisoft places in this particular world is ultimately going to kind of fall apart, because you start to realize that, like, oh, okay, like, wow, I unlocked another gun with another perk that I'll never, ever, ever use. I'm going back to my original shooter, and you're going to stick with that throughout most of the game. The base camps and the progression of kind of taking over Yara and building it as your own, that did feel fun. I will admit I did enjoy that. However, a lot of those base camps that you upgrade and those buildings you upgrade don't matter again because the AI is so stupid. There's really no need to hunt or to fish or to do any of these ancillary quests to build and apply buffs to your character, because most guards are so brain dead that you're never going to be in a situation where you're going to get hurt. Guards don't know how to shoot through windows, even if they're open. Doors, even if they're open, their pathing is atrocious. And you're able to very easily manipulate the simulation to your advantage. And you never have to worry about, like, oh, I should really buff up. And I think back to my World of Warcraft days when you would, before you'd go on a raid, you would cook a bunch of food and everybody would pass out buffs to each other to make you tougher and stronger. You don't need that in this game. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but all those systems become meaningless. You don't need to fish. I never fished once. I mean, yeah, I threw a couple grenades in the water and watched a fish blow out of the water, which was funny. But I never went and hunted down legendary animals for their pelts to increase my inventory size or any of that. And by the way, that was a welcome change. But ultimately, a lot of the upgrades that you get don't matter. I will say, though, that of all those, the fast travel network nodes from the guerrilla hideout were incredible. I love the fact that you could teleport pretty much anywhere on the map, instantly spawn in a wingsuit, and fly to pretty much any destination you needed in a relatively short amount of time. I was very appreciative of that and had a lot of fun with that. In terms of the other vehicles to get around and your rides, this game offers a upgrade system where you can pick one of 4 cars, yes, only 4, that you can upgrade. You can put different guns and armor on them. You saw me summon my car earlier. It had a big, like, concrete bumper on the top, and it shot flame rounds off the top. I had oil slicks on the back, and it did increased ramming damage. Again, it was fun to do when I first initially bought it, but I didn't need it. And as the mechanic system, as they call it, slowly expands and you get more and more perks, you really kind of find out you don't need them anymore. You find the ones that work for you. Definitely not a deep, robust experience like Mad Max, where you're building up the car and the handling and the acceleration and the power increase. And by the end of the game, you're very connected to your vehicle. This game does not offer that system. Not that I would expect it to either, but it definitely does not. Mostly cosmetic upgrades, you get with, like, your dashboard and your, different kinds of, like, paint jobs and everything were fun to play with. But the reality is, at the end of the day, the upgrade system was lacking across the board. Vehicles, guns, bases, whatever. And even though I was putting my quote-unquote stamp on Yara and making it my own, I never really felt like I was better equipped for any job from the beginning. At the end, it was just another mission I had to do with the same basic gun that I had from the beginning. And I think, is it because of that, the game mechanics ultimately do suffer. And you're going to use the same gear throughout the game. And when I talked with my friend Phil, who helped me beat the game at the end, we co-opted together at the end, talking about the gear loadout he was using, it was the exact same loadout he was using an hour in. So it's not just me sticking with the old tried and true, old faithful, whatever your old faithful is. You're going to most likely stick to that. So I think that's a major, for as open world as it is with the crafting system and everything, I think Ubisoft really missed the mark there. I want to give some final thoughts about the game now. I think overall it's pretty good. I mean, I know I kind of panned on some of the mechanics because they're not that great, but I think the story ultimately does help carry it through. It was simple, but batshit crazy, just like every other Far Cry has been. But it does convey a strong message about violence and revolutions and uprisings, and I think it's one of those be careful what you wish for tales. I did like that, and I think that it resonated with me in a way that I didn't expect the Far Cry game to resonate with me, which I was very appreciative for. But really the journey there, You know, meeting mostly nonsensical characters. You meet a few that do make an impact, but for the most part, they're all very one-noted, crazy people. You're upgrading crappy gear and doing kind of basic missions over and over again. It kind of made the journey feel hollow. I mean, I'm not trying to amplify the ending any more than I think it needed to be amplified. I'm sure I'm putting a lot of emphasis into at least my takeaway from the ending, but I don't know if people are going to have that deep philosophical thought with themselves the way I did. They may just see, oh, I did all these things and I get to the big bad. I don't even get a boss fight. The guy kills himself. Oh, and the game's over. So I think a lot of people may look at that and say, oh, this journey did feel slightly hollow. Despite all that, and despite my love for the story, I think this was a very weak Far Cry game, and it may be one of the weakest in the series. It definitely does sour me to potential future installments, and I think when you look at where Ubisoft is as a whole, games like Ghost Recon and Assassin's Creed, suffering from this bloat, this artificial quantity over quality, it really is seeped into this game in a really bad way. And I think a major culture shift is going to be required on Ubisoft's part for me to want to dive back into another game. Sure, it's a fun shoot 'em up, mindless, play with your friends, blow people up, and have some fun. But there are other games that are doing that better, and there are other games that are more rewarding for that experience. So for that reason, I'm not saying avoid this game, but I don't think it's one that you needed to just run out and play. I don't think this is one of those kind of games that everybody's going to be talking about. Again, it does convey a pretty nice message, I think, or an interesting message. Maybe not nice. I don't know if revolution is nice, but it's a clear message. And I think that's the best thing I can say about it. So that wraps up my deep dive review of Far Cry 6. I hope you guys found this review informative, and it maybe makes you think about the game in a slightly different way than you did before. If you like what you saw, please consider commenting, rating, and subscribing. Leave some notes below. Let me know your thoughts on the game. That's it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Take care of yourselves. And until next time, guerillas, I will see you on the other side.